The book I read for my book report is called Billion Dollar Whale. It was written by Tom Wright and Bradley Hope. The authors are actually two Pulitzer Prize finalists and Wall Street Journal reporters. They covered the reporting of this scandal throughout its development and decided to write a book about it in order to shed some light on the situation and what happened. The scandal I'm referring to is the 1MDB scandal and the billions of dollars that was siphoned from Malaysia's sovereign wealth fund called 1MDB by a man named Joe Low. Low used his connections to the Malaysian Prime Minister to gain the authority of running the investment fund, and during the years of 2010 to 2016, Low embezzled about $4.5 billion from the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund. He hid the money through a maze of shell companies and offshore bank accounts, and he used the money to buy mansions, penthouses in New York City, and many properties worth tens of millions of dollars each. And he also bought hundreds of millions of dollars worth of rare art, fancy cars, jewelry, and other things. And he also used the money to finance some of the most star-studded and elaborate parties I've ever heard of, and most anybody has ever heard of. Some of these parties made the Great Gatsby or Jordan Belfort look like amateurs. You can read about some of these parties online. He also paid off his associates as well as the Malaysian Prime Minister uh, with some of this money, and he also paid off anybody who was contributing to this plot. The fund secured over $11 billion in debt, but it actually had no operations or businesses in place to return the interest on this debt and to pay it back. Lowe actually formed a media company that was responsible for funding the films The Wolf of Wall Street, Daddy's Home, Dumb and Dumber 2, as well as a few others, but this was hardly enough to make a dent in any of the debt payments that was required to pay back 1MDB's debtors. The book took you on a journey through the process of how Joe Low was able to steal billions of dollars and use it to fund his lavish lifestyle, as well as how journalists and authorities snuffed it out. How the main way I believe data analytics can relate to this story is through its use in regulatory, investigative, and compliance purposes. The reason this scandal was able to go on for 6 years was because regulators and compliance officers either never noticed the suspicious transfers of money or simply overlooked them. The amount of dollars and transactions flowing between countries every single day is very massive, so it's easy to overlook things. This is where big data, I believe, can be tied into the discussion. These money transfers are all recorded by the banks who authorize the transfers. For example, Wells Fargo, according to the book, moves over $1 trillion every day through its money transferring functions. So I believe big data analytics could be used to look into these transactions for any suspicious activities. For example, Joe Low used to transfer money through big banks all the time. He used shell corporations, and one in particular that he named Gold Star, to transfer these monies. If money of a certain dollar amount is coming through the bank, it must be made clear the source of the funds, where it's going, as well as the purpose of the transfer. I believe big data analytics could have possibly flagged some of these transactions and caught this scandal going on a lot earlier than it did. Big data analytics could also be used for regulatory or investigative purposes. For example, super expensive real estate was one way that Joe Low hid his money, and real estate transactions are usually public information, especially if they are really expensive pieces of property. Regulators who defend against money laundering understand that hard assets like real estate and jewelry are popular ways to store wealth, especially if it's dirty money. These regulators could have used data analytics to find out that numerous mansions and penthouses were being purchased all across the country under the same name, using money that was transferred from the same bank account. While this is not a guarantee of money laundering, it can be a red flag, and it can lead to any probable cause to investigate, which also could have led to him being found out a lot earlier than this scandal was. My favorite part of the book was actually the ending, and the reason for this is because this is when the authors explain the legal actions that were taken against the people responsible for all these money laundering schemes, as well as the bankers at Goldman Sachs who authorized the sale of bonds to raise a bunch of money for 1MDB. The reason I enjoyed this part of the book is because many people ended up going to jail for it, actually. The investigation began as a civil lawsuit, which meant that people's assets were frozen and large fines were handed out, but no jail time was handed out. These penalties never really stick. They are always, they don't really deter white-collar crime from happening again. Even if we look back at the 2008 financial crisis, That crisis was caused by the greed of bankers and mortgage brokers. And after the crisis, only one banker was sentenced to jail. And this was all after causing millions of people to lose their jobs, hundreds of millions of people losing huge portions of their retirement funds, while also crippling the world economy. Sure, the banks saw large fines, but for the most part, taxpayers were the ones that funded the bailout and were hurt the most. After all this, the banks still kind of act the way they did before the crisis, and this just goes to show that big fines don't really scare banks or bankers. They have enough money to pay whatever fines are thrown their way. Jail time, however, can actually scare people and act as more of a deterrent for crimes in the future. And as I mentioned, the 1MDB case began as a civil suit, but then it transitioned into a criminal suit after the U.S. authorities and as well as authorities from other countries involved decided that this was worth a criminal lawsuit. They've already arrested numerous people involved in this crisis, and various countries have a warrant out for Jho Low's arrest. And I like this because it gives people a sense that justice is actually being served, and because prison time is a greater deterrent for crimes in the future than just fines. Overall, I like the book. It was pretty complicated to follow where the money was coming and going, but at the end of the day, the authors did a really good job laying it out, and I would suggest reading it. Thanks for listening.